I almost said no. That was the scariest part. Not the uncertainty, not the fear of failing, just how close I came to walking away, to choosing the easy way out. I stood outside the heavy conference room door, my breath coming too fast, my palms damp. Through the frosted glass, I could see shadows shifting, hear the low murmur of voices inside. They were waiting for me. I could still leave. The thought hit like an escape hatch, an off-ramp from this slow-moving disaster. If I walked away now, no one would know. No one would have to see me choke. No one would have to watch me prove that I was exactly what I always feared, not enough. I could already picture it. The way my voice would tremble when I spoke. The way they'd exchange subtle glances, realizing I didn't belong. Someone else, someone sharper, smarter, more confident, should be standing where I was. My stomach twisted. I wasn't ready. That's what I told myself every time an opportunity presented itself, every time someone suggested I take a chance. Not ready. Not good enough. Not yet. The pattern had started small, turning down projects, deflecting praise, keeping my head down instead of stepping up. But lately, it had begun to suffocate me. Every day, I watched people around me move forward while I stayed frozen in place, waiting for something I couldn't even name. And now? Now I had let myself get talked into this. A friend had convinced me to apply, saying it was exactly the kind of thing I needed. I submitted my name as a joke, convinced I wouldn't get in. But I had. And now, here I was. The pressure in my chest built. My mind raced, scrambling for an excuse, a reason to walk away that wouldn't make me feel like a coward. There was still time to leave. I took a step back. Then another. Maybe next year. Maybe when I was more prepared. Maybe. The doors swung open. I startled, heart lurching. A woman stepped out, scrolling through her phone, barely glancing at me. She had that effortless kind of confidence, the kind I had spent my entire life trying to fake. Her gaze flickered up. "Are you coming in?" My mouth went dry. I tried to speak, but nothing came out. She barely waited for an answer before striding away, her heels clicking against the tile floor. I exhaled shakily. This was it. My last chance to say no. No one would blame me if I walked away. I could send an apologetic email later, come up with an excuse, maybe an emergency, maybe food poisoning. No one would think twice. But then I thought about all the other times I had almost done something. The job I hadn't applied for because I didn't think I was qualified. The opportunity one had turned down because I was afraid of looking stupid. The relationship I had let slip away because I was too scared to be vulnerable. I thought about all the times I had told myself, next time, next year, maybe later, and the crushing realization that later had never come. I had spent so much of my life waiting to be ready. What if I never was? A sharp voice echoed in my mind. You always quit before it gets hard. That's why you'll never make it. My father's words, tossed at me years ago, burned fresh in my memory. Maybe he was right. Maybe I was a quitter. Maybe this was exactly the moment I'd look back on years from now with regret, wondering what could have been. My pulse pounded. The weight of it all, the years of hesitation, the suffocating fear, the creeping dread of staying stuck, climbed to a breaking point. Before I could overthink it, before I could let my fear make the decision for me, I grabbed the door handle, and I walked inside. The room was larger than I expected, the air thick with the low hum of quiet conversation. Rows of chairs faced a long table at the front where a panel of 4 people sat, flipping through papers, murmuring among themselves. A few others were already seated, some looking as uncertain as I felt, while others carried an ease I envied. The kind of confidence that came from knowing you belonged. I hesitated at the entrance, fighting the urge to turn back. But then someone brushed past me, a man in his late 30s with an easy, practiced smile. He nodded at me, then slid into his seat near the front without hesitation. No pause, no doubt. Just movement. I forced myself forward, choosing a seat in the middle. Close enough to be engaged, far enough to stay unnoticed. A woman at the front stood. We'll get started in a few minutes. Her tone was crisp, professional. Make sure you've signed in. If you need to step out, do so before we begin. I nodded, though she wasn't speaking to me directly. My hands rested on my lap, fingers twisting together. I felt like I was waiting for something terrible to happen. Then, the worst thing possible. My name was called. I snapped to attention, stomach plummeting. One of the panelists, an older man with wire-rimmed glasses and an unreadable expression, looked up from his papers. You're up first. It took a second for the words to register. I wasn't supposed to go first. There were at least 10 people in the room. Why me? I swallowed hard, my body already stiffening with the beginnings of panic. I glanced around, hoping someone would protest, Tell him I wasn't ready. But no one did. No one cared. I forced myself to stand, legs unsteady beneath me. Every step toward the front felt like dragging through wet cement. I could feel the weight of every eye on me, waiting, expectant, judging. Go ahead, the man prompted when I hesitated. My mouth went dry. I had prepared for this. I had spent weeks rehearsing my words, imagining every possible question. But standing here now, under the weight of their silent scrutiny, everything I had planned felt flimsy and inadequate. I opened my mouth. Nothing came out. Seconds stretched. The silence thickened. A flicker of something unreadable passed over the man's face before he leaned back, tapping his pen against the table. Did you come prepared? The way he said it wasn't cruel, but it sliced through me all the same. I forced out a reply, voice weaker than I wanted. Yes. Sorry, I wasn't even sure how to finish that sentence. The older man exhaled through his nose, closing the folder in front of him. Take a deep breath. Start when you're ready. I nodded, clenching my hands together to stop them from shaking. I tried again, pushing through the tightness in my throat. This time, my voice came out. Not strong, not confident, but enough. I spoke. I stumbled. I fumbled over my words, lost my place, had to stop twice to collect myself. But I didn't stop. When I finally finished, my pulse was pounding in my ears. The panel exchanged glances. The older man adjusted his glasses, studying me for an uncomfortably long time. Then he nodded. Thank you. That was it. No feedback. No reaction. Just those two words before he gestured for the next person. I nodded stiffly, returning to my seat. My face was burning. I had no idea if I had just ruined my chances or if it had been passable. No one was reacting. No one was whispering or staring, which somehow made it worse. The next person stood, and the process continued. I barely heard them. My mind was stuck on everything I could have done better. Every moment I had hesitated. Every time I had let fear creep into my voice. I had wanted this, hadn't I? So why did it feel like I had already failed? The session dragged on, each person going up, each performance blurring into the next. I kept my face neutral, pretending to listen, but I was caught in my own spiral. When the last person finished, the panelist with the glasses stood. Thank you all for your time today. We'll be making our final selections by next week. You'll be contacted if you're chosen to move forward. Chairs scraped against the floor as people began gathering their things. Conversations hummed around me, low and casual. I stayed seated for a moment, hands tied in my lap. My body felt like it was vibrating from the adrenaline, but I wasn't sure if it was from the rush of having gotten through it or the sinking dread that I had blown my only chance. As I stood to leave, I heard someone behind me. You know, that wasn't bad. I turned. The man who had nodded at me earlier was watching me, arms crossed, expression unreadable. I forced out a half-smile. You don't have to be nice. I'm not, he said, matter of fact. You hesitated. You second-guessed. But you kept going. I let out a sharp breath, shaking my head. Doesn't feel like that's enough. He studied me for a beat, then shrugged. Maybe not. But it's better than the alternative. Before I could ask what he meant, he was already heading toward the door. I lingered for a moment longer, then grabbed my things and followed. Stepping into the hallway, I let out a slow breath. The tension hadn't fully left my body, but something about the air out here felt lighter. Maybe because, for once, I hadn't walked away. I wasn't sure if I had done well enough. I wasn't sure if I would be chosen. But for the first time in a long time, I wasn't stuck in the past. I had done something, even if it wasn't perfect. And maybe, for now, that had to be enough. The email came 4 days later. I almost didn't open it. My finger hovered over the notification, heart hammering. I had imagined this moment 100 different ways, most of them ending in disappointment. Maybe a polite rejection, a vague "we appreciate your time," or, worse, no response at all. Silence. The kind that confirmed what I feared most. I wasn't enough. But I clicked it anyway. We are pleased to inform you that you have been selected to move forward to the next stage. I froze. Reread the words. Then reread them again, waiting for them to shift into something less promising. They didn't. My breath caught in my throat. For the first time in a long time, I had made it through something. I should have felt relief. I should have celebrated. Instead, my stomach twisted with a different kind of fear. The next stage was in person. A live evaluation, no room for hesitation or second-guessing. No chance to carefully edit my words before speaking, no safety net to hide behind. They expected more from me. I barely survived the first round, and now they wanted to see if I could handle real pressure. Maybe they made a mistake. Maybe they picked me as a fluke. Maybe they'd see through me the moment I walked into the room. I had spent so much of my life avoiding situations like this, where I could fail publicly, where I could embarrass myself beyond repair. And now I had willingly walked straight into it. By the time I arrived for the second session, my stomach was a knot of nerves. The air in the room was different this time. There were fewer people, maybe half as many as before. The ones who remained carried themselves differently, more focused, more sure of themselves. I felt like an outsider again. The panelists had changed too. The older man with the wire-rimmed glasses was gone. In his place sat a woman in her 40s, her posture rigid, eyes sharp. She barely glanced at us before she spoke. "You have 1 hour. You'll be working in pairs." Her tone was clipped, efficient. She didn't waste time with small talk. She just read through the list of names, pairing us off like it was already decided who was worth remembering. Then I heard mine. I turned as my partner stepped forward. A man in his early 30s, tall, composed, the kind of person who looked like he had done this a dozen times before. His handshake was firm, his voice smooth. "You ready?" "No." But I nodded anyway. The task sounded simple on paper, a problem-solving exercise, a live discussion where we had to present a solution to a crisis scenario. But the moment we started, I felt myself shrinking. He spoke first. He was fast, confident, laying out a framework before I even had a chance to process the details. He didn't dominate the conversation, not intentionally, but he didn't hesitate either. He filled every gap, every silence, every moment I might have used to gather my thoughts. And I let him. I tried to interject, but I wasn't quick enough. Every time I found an opening, he was already 2 steps ahead, moving the conversation forward before I could speak. I felt it happening in real time, the slow fade into the background. The panelists watched from across the room, silent, observant. And I knew exactly what they were seeing. A strong speaker and his quiet, forgettable partner. My chest tightened. If I didn't do something now, I would disappear. I would be overlooked, dismissed, discarded before I even had the chance to prove myself. The old voice in my head whispered that maybe that was where I belonged. I gritted my teeth. Not this time. I cut in, speaking over him before he could continue. My voice was sharper than I intended, my words spilling out too fast, but I forced my way in. He stopped mid-sentence, startled. For the first time, I had the floor. I pushed through, my heart hammering, my voice steady despite the fear clawing at my throat. I wasn't just nodding along anymore. I was leading. I challenged his points. I pushed back. I reshaped the discussion. The moment stretched longer than I expected, and for the first time since this whole process began, I felt in control. When time was called, my pulse was still racing. I had no idea if I had done well enough. I had no idea if I had won them over. But when I glanced at the panelists, the woman in the center was watching me differently than before. The session ended. Chairs scraped against the floor as people gathered their things. Conversations hummed around me, but I stayed seated, my hands still clenched in my lap. I hadn't disappeared. As I stood, a voice came from behind me. "You came alive at the end there." I turned. It was my partner, watching me with a small, knowing smile. I hesitated, unsure if he meant it as a compliment or an observation. "I thought I lost you at first," he continued. "Didn't think you were going to fight for it." "I almost didn't," I admitted. He nodded, as if that didn't surprise him. "You should do that more." "Do what?" "Step up before it's too late." His tone was casual, but there was something pointed about it. Like he had seen right through me. "It suits you." I had no response for that. Before I could think of one, he clapped me on the shoulder and walked off. A week passed. Then another. The final email came late on a Wednesday night. I had been checking obsessively, bracing for rejection. My chest tightened when I opened it, preparing for the worst. "Congratulations. You have been selected." I stared at the screen. My brain struggled to process it. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't luck. This was me. I had almost said no. I had almost let fear make the decision for me. And if I had, I never would have known what I was capable of. The final stage wasn't what I expected. After weeks of preparing for another grueling test, another round of scrutiny, I walked into the room and found only a single chair facing a long table. No teams. No exercises. Just me and the panel. A woman with cropped hair and a cold, assessing gaze gestured for me to sit. The others were silent, hands folded, waiting. The atmosphere was different from the previous rounds, less about performance, more about judgment. I sat, my pulse hammering in my ears. No one spoke. The silence stretched, calculated, and deliberate. I knew what they were doing, testing me before the conversation even began. The woman glanced down at my file. You weren't our strongest candidate. I stiffened. We watched your progress. Hesitant at first, almost invisible in the beginning. You second-guessed yourself. You lacked presence. We debated whether you should move forward at all. I forced my expression to stay neutral, but my chest tightened. Then she looked up. But then something changed. The man beside her, older, more measured, interlaced his fingers. Tell us why. What shifted? I swallowed. They wanted an explanation, but I wasn't sure I had one. I could make something up, say I had found my confidence, that I had always been capable but just needed time. But that wasn't the truth. The truth was, I had almost walked away. Twice. The truth was, I still wasn't sure if I belonged here. The silence dragged. I could feel the weight of their patience thinning. This was the moment. I took a breath. I realized something. I said finally. My voice was steady, but I could hear the tension in it. I've spent most of my life waiting to be ready. I thought confidence was something that would just happen. One day, I'd wake up and finally feel like I belonged. I let out a quiet breath. But that day never came. And it wasn't going to. No one reacted. They let me speak, but I could tell they were waiting for something more. I gripped my hands together under the table. So I stopped waiting. The woman tapped a pen against the table, considering. And do you think that's enough? I knew what she was really asking. I could feel it in the room, the unspoken challenge. If I faltered now, if I hesitated even a second too long, it would confirm everything they suspected about me, that I was unsure, that I was weak, that I would break under pressure. I held her gaze. It's a start. A flicker of something, approval, crossed her face before she looked back down. We'll see. The rest of the conversation was a blur. They pressed me on my choices, my approach, my weaknesses. I answered every question, some more confidently than others, but I didn't look away. When it ended, they dismissed me without ceremony. No feedback. No indication of how I had done. Just a simple, we'll be in touch. I walked out with my heart still pounding. For the first time, I wasn't sure if I had passed or failed. But as I stepped into the cold air outside, one thought repeated in my head. I didn't go home right away. I walked instead, mind racing. The adrenaline hadn't faded yet, and I could still feel the weight of the panel's eyes on me, dissecting my every word, every hesitation, every crack in my voice. Had I sounded convincing enough? Had I shown them that I belonged? Or had I just confirmed their doubts? I replayed the conversation over and over in my mind, my own words twisting, turning, reshaping into something weaker than they had felt in the moment. I imagined them sitting around that table after I left, exchanging knowing looks. Not strong enough. Not assertive enough. Still too uncertain. A sick feeling settled in my stomach. I passed a coffee shop and went inside, barely noticing what I ordered before sitting down in the corner. My hands were still trembling slightly. I clenched them into fists against my lap. Maybe I shouldn't have been so honest. Maybe I should have told them what they wanted to hear, given them the version of me that seemed polished, capable, sure of myself. But wasn't that what had gotten me here in the first place? Hesitating, overthinking, waiting until I had the right words instead of just speaking? I took a slow sip of coffee, the warmth doing little to ease the tension in my chest. The worst part wasn't the fear of rejection. It was knowing that I had given everything I could, and it still might not be enough. The door chimed as someone else walked in, and I glanced up, barely paying attention, until I recognized the man from the previous round. The one I had been paired with. He saw me immediately, gave a short nod, and ordered his drink. I expected him to leave after that, but instead, he walked over and sat across from me. Guess we're both waiting, huh? He took a sip of his coffee, studying me for a moment. How'd it go? I hesitated, then exhaled sharply. I don't know. He smirked. That bad? No, I said quickly, then frowned. At least, I don't think so. They didn't say anything. They never do. He leaned back, tapping his fingers against the side of his cup. They want to see how you handle uncertainty. If you need validation, you're already at a disadvantage. I stared at him. He said it so easily, like it was something he had understood for years, while I was only just figuring it out. You seemed confident in there, I muttered. He let out a short laugh. I wasn't. That surprised me. He shrugged. Confidence isn't about knowing you'll win. It's about showing up like you already have. He met my gaze. You didn't do that at first, but you did by the end. I wasn't sure how to respond. You remind me of myself a few years ago, he continued. Second-guessing everything. Feeling like you have to prove that you deserve to be in the room. He leaned forward slightly. Let me give you some advice. I nodded slowly. You don't have to prove anything to them, he said. You have to prove it to yourself. Something about the way he said it settled in my chest differently than anything else I had heard before. The door chimed again, and he stood. Good luck, he said simply. But I don't think you'll need it. I watched him go, his words lingering long after he disappeared into the crowd outside. For the first time, I felt something loosen inside me. Not confidence, not exactly, but something close. The email came a week later. I almost didn't open it. Even after everything, even after pushing myself through every moment of doubt, my instincts still told me to look away, to pretend I hadn't seen it, to delay the answer just a little longer, as if that would somehow make a difference. But I forced myself to click. Congratulations. We are pleased to offer you a place in the program. My chest tightened. I skimmed over the rest of the email, details, next steps, formalities, but none of it fully registered. My mind was stuck on the one thing that mattered. I made it. After every hesitation, every near miss, every moment I had been convinced I wasn't good enough, I had been chosen. I should have felt relief, maybe even excitement. But as the initial shock wore off, a different feeling settled in my stomach. Now I actually had to do this. The self-doubt, the hesitation, it wasn't gone. I had proven that I could push through it, but it was still there, lurking beneath the surface, waiting for its moment. What if I had just been lucky? What if they expected something from me that I couldn't deliver? What if, after all this, I still wasn't enough? The night before my first official day, I sat at my desk, rereading the email, as if trying to convince myself it was real. My fingers hovered over the confirm attendance button. It should have been easy. A simple click. But my mind kept whispering the same thing it always had. Maybe this isn't for you. Maybe you shouldn't be here. My phone buzzed, pulling me out of my thoughts. An unknown number. I hesitated before answering. I was wondering if you were actually going to pick up. The voice was familiar, and it took me a second to place it. The guy from the last round. My partner from the exercise. I hadn't expected to hear from him again. How did you get my number? He let out a short laugh. We're both on the final list. They sent out a roster. I glanced at my screen, realizing I had ignored most of the attachments in the email. Figured I'd check in, he said. See if you were still planning to show up tomorrow, or if you were sitting there convincing yourself you don't deserve to be on that list. My stomach twisted. I didn't answer right away, but I knew the pause was enough. He sighed. Look, I get it, he said. I've been where you are. You think you got lucky. You think someone made a mistake. And now you're scared because if you fail, you can't say you never had a chance. I pressed the heel of my palm against my forehead. He had put into words the exact fear I hadn't wanted to admit. But let me give you something to think about, he continued. You didn't just pass. You fought for this. You changed during the process. I watched it happen. So now, the only question left is, are you going to show up again? The line was quiet for a moment. I exhaled slowly. I'll be there. Good, he said simply. See you tomorrow. The call ended, but I didn't move right away. I sat there, staring at my phone, his words still echoing in my head. I had spent so much time fearing failure that I had never considered what would happen if I actually succeeded. The next morning, I arrived early. The building felt bigger than before, more imposing. Though I knew it hadn't changed, I had. I walked through the halls, my heart pounding, but I didn't hesitate this time. At the entrance to the conference room, I saw my name on the list. My name. Not as a maybe, not as an afterthought, but as someone who had earned their place. I stepped inside, and the moment I did, I caught sight of the woman from the panel. She stood near the front, speaking to someone, but then her gaze flickered toward me. For a brief second, our eyes met. There was no nod, no greeting, no grand acknowledgement. But there was recognition, and that was enough. I took a seat. Around me, others were settling in, some confident, some hesitant, some probably feeling exactly how I had felt just a few weeks ago. I understood them now in a way I hadn't before. The moment stretched. The air in the room shifted. I realized something then, something I should have understood long ago. I had almost said no. I had almost let my fear make the decision for me. And if I had, I never would have known what I was capable of.